Alright, we're going to get started with our tools and materials. You're going to want something to put your transfer on. I've started with a piece of wood that I've painted. I've got a layer of white paint, stenciled some pink on there, and also did some collage of a piece of paper. I've also coated this with a layer of my gel medium also. You can use anything, paper, cardboard, wood. The harder the surface, or the more sturdy the surface, the better transfer you're going to get. So, you're going to want some sort of medium, acrylic medium. I'm using Mod Podge, but you could use gel medium, any sort of acrylic medium that you would find in your craft or art supply store will work just fine. If you're doing large-scale projects, household caulk works just as well, and it's relatively cheap. It's much thicker, so you're going to have to experiment. And with any of these mediums, you're going to have to experiment with what works best for you. But we're using Mod Podge today. You're going to need some water, a brush. You don't have to use a brush. You could use your finger, but something to put the gel medium down with. Depending on how big your piece of wood or paper is, depends on how big your brush is. And finally, the image that you're going to be transferring. I'm using this image. A brief note on images and text. If you want to use text in your imagery, make sure it's reading the wrong way, so that when anything you transfer is going to be flipped. So if you're using text, you want to make sure you scan it in and flip it using some sort of image editing software before doing so. Another brief note on transfers. I'm using laser prints, color laser prints. You can use black and white laser prints. You can use old magazines, pictures from old books. The older the media, the more brittle the paper is going to be, and sometimes the less reliable your image transfer is going to be. But that's kind of the beauty of image transfers. You not really know what you're going to get until you've done it. So I like that a lot about this technique. It's somewhat unpredictable, but that's a good thing. So we're going to get started first by, I'm going to put a little bit of Mod Podge down on my surface here. You want to be liberal about it, but not too much. You want to get a nice even coat. If you're using caulk on big scale pieces like I mentioned before, you can just load up your caulk gun, throw down a few tubes of caulk, and then spread it around with a credit card or an old piece of cardboard or something like that. But gel mediums usually, depending on how thick they are, they go down pretty smooth, and you can smooth it out relatively quickly. One of the advantages of having a nice dry coat down before I start here is now I've got two coats, and the more coats the better, really. You can kind of build up kind of an encaustic texture and keep going with this. I'm going to put quite a bit down here because I want to make sure my transfer is nice. I've got a nice solid coat. You can protect the edges if you care about that so that it doesn't drip. I'm not too concerned about that right now. So just smooth this out. Now your next step is to get your paper damp, and that helps in making sure that everything is smooth. You can skip this process and just go straight down with a dry sheet. But I've found that if I wet my paper first, it allows me to get all the air bubbles out when I transfer everything down. And air bubbles, you want to make sure you get rid of air bubbles, because air bubbles, everywhere you have an air bubble, you're not going to get a transfer, or the ink isn't going to transfer. Basically what we're doing is transferring the ink onto the Mod Podge, and we're going to remove the paper in our next step. So another advantage of wetting your paper is you can see through it. I don't know if you can tell through the video, but you can actually kind of see what you're doing and position it where you want it, because I want this right at the edge, and if I were doing this dry I wouldn't be able to see through my paper. So now I can see what I'm doing. You just want to carefully smooth out any air bubbles that you see. I don't see very many, so I'm just going to leave it alone, but if I had air bubbles I would want to just carefully smooth it out. You don't want to press down too hard or roll it with a roller or brayer or something, because then all of your medium would ooze out, or a significant amount would, and you don't want that to happen either. So I'm going to let this dry. It usually takes, depending on your location, your heat and your humidity, I like to let it dry 24 hours, but as long as it's bone dry or just dry to the touch, you can go back for this next step. So we're going to let this dry and come back when it's fully dry, and we'll take off the paper and you can see how the image transferred. Alright, so everything is dry. As you can see, the paper is now opaque. You can see through it a little bit. But next step, we're going to just start with a little water and get your paper wet. You can start to see through it again. I like to use my fingers on small pieces because I can kind of feel the paper lifting up. If you're doing big pieces, you might want to consider using a rag or a very low tooth sandpaper. You don't want to take off too much of the paper and get through to the ink, so it's kind of a fine line, but you definitely want to get rid of that paper. It's a little bit of a messy process, but it's just paper. So we're going to start here with the face in the middle, and I'm just wetting it as I go. You can wet the whole thing, get it really soaked, or you could just work a little area at a time. One thing to note is it's going to come off in stages. I've found that you're going to get most of your paper off in one shot, and then there's going to be kind of a haze, if you will, of paper at the very end. So it's kind of a fine line of getting all the paper off. Sometimes you're going to be left with a little haze of paper that you can varnish over, and usually that'll take care of it. But like I said, it's kind of an experiment. This part of the process is my favorite because you don't really know what you're going to get until you start doing it. It's kind of like being in the dark room and developing a negative, because you don't really know what you're going to get until you make the print. Now this section right here, if you can see where my finger is pointing, I had an air bubble right there. That's what's going to happen when you have an air bubble, or it might not be that the paper is completely dry. So if you're a little bit impatient, then that's what will happen. I'm not too concerned about that. I tend to welcome mistakes, so it just depends on how picky you are about your transfer. So I'm going to just keep going with this. You can kind of see how what the final product is going to be. And just a brief note, it is somewhat transparent, so you can do some color mixing. If you have some primary colors on top of each other, they're going to mix, which gives you a pretty cool effect. It's kind of why I put some color in this, so you can kind of see how it mixes with other colors. So there is that element to it as well. So I'm just going to keep going with this, and you'll be able to see a final product as a still image in the blog post. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope if you do try it, give us a shout out on the blog and tell us what you think. Thanks a lot, and come back soon.